To begin, everyone is muted and will remain so in order to make sure we don't have any background noise while our presenters are sharing. If you do have any issues with video quality during the call, please try turning your video off or moving closer to your router. If you do have questions, and we sincerely hope that you do throughout the presentation, please feel free to put those in the Q&A. And those can be sent. If you look around the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A button. You can click that and put your questions in there. And then at the end, we will have a designated question and answer period. And lastly, you'll notice that we are recording. So we will be sharing this presentation on our YouTube channels and via email to all who registered. That way we can share with those who weren't able to join us this evening. So welcome to folks who are joining us. And before we begin tonight's presentation, I'd like to take a moment first to thank those who provided feedback on the event and led to the change in its title. And I'd like to share that tonight's talk will focus on Wild Hudson Valley's archival research and report on the pre-colonial human history of Columbia County, including at the public lands CLC currently stewards today. We'll then hear from previous intern Kira Gruber about how this report is being used to create new interpretive signage at CLC public lands that center the history and legacy of historic Native land stewardship. This research project will be shared with those communities once it is completed and available by reading by interested members of the public. This work was funded and made possible by a Land Trust Alliance New York State Conservation Partnership Program grant. This project is just one example of the work CLC is doing to build relationships and collaborate with Native communities, which is ongoing and has been in progress for years. In order to have enough time to focus on Justin's research, which is extensive, and honor those relationships, we will not be delving into all of these activities during tonight's talks, as we are dedicated to putting those relationships first. You also may not hear immediately about what CLC is working toward with our partners until an appropriate juncture. And if you have ideas or contacts for CLC to consider, we would love to hear from you. And please email hello@columbialand.org. We also want to make clear that we are not speaking for or representing these communities. The ideas and experiences presented here tonight are the speaker's own. With that, I want to begin by reading the Columbia Land Conservancy's land acknowledgement. We humbly and gratefully acknowledge that Columbia County, New York, is predominantly on the ancestral lands of the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans, who are the indigenous people of this land. They were subject to genocide, coerced into assimilation, and forcibly removed from their homelands to what is now known as Wisconsin. They continue to retain their unbroken status as a sovereign Native nation. Despite removal, they continue to hold relationships with their homelands and settler communities. As a land trust and the current steward of this place, CLC understands that access to land is a sacred and collective right. CLC recognizes the indigenous history of this land, honors ancestors past and present, and supports current efforts to build more equitable spaces for all the human and non-human relatives who call this place home. As such, it is a living document and never completed. It is also impossible for a short statement to convey the complexity and nuance of colonialization. Though this land acknowledgement uses the passive voice phrase, "we're subject to," it is important to recognize that the Mohican Nation held power and agency. Their ability to retain their status as a sovereign nation and remain legal owners of their ancestral lands for well over a century after they held a minority in their own territory is a testament to their skills in diplomacy. Having said that, I now want to present our speakers for the evening. Justin Wexler, a lifelong resident of the Hudson Valley, has devoted his life to sharing his love for the natural world and for the region's original inhabitants. Obsessed with nature from his earliest years, he has spent most of his life either in the outdoors or in his research on local history and ethnoecology. He has studied regional Algonquin languages, history, and folklore for over 2 decades, sharing discoveries with scholars and with tribal language departments. He has a BA in history and anthropology from Marlborough College in Marlborough, Vermont, a professional certificate in environmental policy from Bard College, and a Master's of Arts in teaching from Bard College. It's also my pleasure to introduce Kira Gruber. Kira Gruber has both an undergraduate degree and a master's in political science from the University of Albany, specifically the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs. This past summer, she served as the Education and Outreach Intern for the Columbia Land Conservancy, where she participated in initiatives to promote public land visits, conservation, and inclusivity. Currently, Kira is placed at the Three-Way Authority through the New York State Excelsior Fellowship Program in the Office of Media and Government Relations. As a nature lover, she enjoys hiking, with friends and spending time outdoors whenever possible. Kira is passionate about making a positive impact in both public service and environmental efforts. With that, it is my pleasure to pass it over to Justin Wexler. Thank you for being here. It's a joy to hear you speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Mallory, and thank you to the Columbia Land Conservancy for supporting this work. Hi, everyone. My name is Justin Wexler. Um, I'm going to go through this as quickly as possible, given the limited time that we have. And I'll just quick background summary. I grew up actually in Columbia County, just south of Hudson, New York. I've lived up and down throughout the Hudson Valley and Catskills my entire life. And I've had this burning question in my mind for most of my life. What did the landscape look like in the days before the colonists came? How has the landscape changed? How did the environment here, how did the ecosystems here, the animals, plants, even the topography, the weather, shape the beliefs, the culture of the native peoples who call the Hudson Valley their homeland? And how do the native peoples of this land, how did they shape the land here? And, one thing I've discovered over many years is that the legacy, even though the Mohican and other Lenape people who call the Hudson Valley their ancestral homeland have been displaced for well over 2 centuries, we can still strongly see their legacy in the species diversity that is still present on the landscape, on the dominant trees in certain places. And that's something that I really um, went into and emphasized a lot. At least I try to in the report that I did for CLC, which will be available. It's done, but it's, as Mallory mentioned, any of this kind of work is always an ongoing progress. You're always going to find more and more. So I guess we could go to the next slide. So I just want to note, I'm not a native person. My family are all recent immigrants to this continent. And just like CLC, I'm not representing any of the native communities who call this land their homeland. But one of the ways I think in which, as an independent scholar, my work maybe is unique, at least in terms of the study of the relationship between people, native peoples, and the land in the Hudson Valley, is I've spent years connecting with traditional knowledge keepers and um, government representatives of the various displaced federally recognized communities who call the Hudson Valley and Delaware Valley as well their ancestral homelands, and who today now live in Ontario, Wisconsin, and Oklahoma. And I'll get into this a little bit more in, I'd say, 5 or 10 minutes or so, but I will just note now in advance that the people, although forced from their homeland so long ago, and in some cases through a multi-generational, very traumatic journey, Mohican and other Lenape people still hold on to a wealth of traditional knowledge about land management that I think we could stand, those of us living here in their traditional homeland, we could stand to learn much from them. But without a time machine, and with these communities having been displaced so long ago, one of the main ways that we can delve into little micro parts of landscape or the land as a whole is through the archival record. So that is eyewitness accounts that were left behind by observers, typically outside observers before the 1750s. So that includes, early, let's say, adventurers, merchants, politicians, missionaries, all sorts of people who left behind a written record that has survived to this day. You have to, going through these records, remember that you're looking through the eyes of somebody in a different culture, speaking a different language, even if that's 17th century English, it's still quite different from 21st century English. You have to see through their biases. And through all of that, you're observing another culture in another time. So it's kind of a rough thing to do, and it's takes a lot of patience and persistence and a lot of comparing various records. I'm not going to go too far into other sources of information like archaeology and looking at, uh, paleontology. So looking at pollen in bog or lake sediments, so that will help you determine what the tree species and other predominantly wind pollinated plant species composition was over time. You can often see how humans have influenced the landscape through that. Um, but mostly I'm going to talk about language tonight. So the map on your screen in front of you, that's a map from later in the 18th century. That's a stretch of Kinderhook Creek near what is Wallachia today. And remember that by the mid 18th century, already a century and a half had passed since the first settlers started showing up in the Hudson Valley. I'm not going to say settlers because they weren't settlers. These were, transient traders at first, people coming to make money, buy furs from the Mohican people and other native peoples they were encountering in the Hudson Valley. So in that 150 years, a lot had changed. We're talking by this point, the Mohican people are still living in Columbia County and in the rest of their ancestral land, but they are now a tiny minority in their homeland, which is still largely rural. But I'm just saying the landscape had already undergone some major changes by this time. As early as the 1630s and 40s, the Dutch were already starting to dam some streams for sawmills and for grist mills, etc. Forest was being cleared in different ways. As the native population went down, those land management methods that argue left a really strong legacy still visible in the landscape today, they started to happen on a smaller scale, perhaps, and started to decline. But what's interesting is that in this map, you're seeing some Mohican place names. So you can see one at the bend of Kinderhook Creek, it says Pachaquac. And then you can see another one to the right of that, it says the Hill Pentecost. And these place names actually, they're present in this map because these were place names in the original land deeds for this stretch of Kinderhook Creek. And when CLC asked me to really look into the land use history of the different public access sites of the 10 public conservation areas that CLC has in the county, really the first thing I go for is land deeds as a source of information. And this is not new or novel. There have been a number of scholars who have really excelled at this over the decades, most notably Shirley Dunn, who wrote a number of books on the Mohican people using predominantly the wealth and land deeds that survive in archives, municipal archives, state archives to this day, even in private collections. But you have to keep in mind that one of the ways in which the Mohican people and the other Lenape peoples of the Hudson Valley, as well as non-Lenape people like the Mohawks and other Haudenosaunee people to our west in the interior of New York State, one of the ways that they were able to survive and maintain their sovereignty as tribal nations, as minorities in the colonial world, was by very carefully selling their land. As they grew to understand what that meant, you know, having different ideas, cultural ideas of, land tenure. They began to sell their land in little bits and pieces, hundreds of times, sometimes the same piece of land several times over if they felt like they weren't sufficiently compensated. This led to a lot of complications. There were sometimes major fraudulent purchases on the part of selfish colonists, but this really represents one of the many ways in which native peoples were, as a tiny minority in an increasingly powerful society surrounding them, were able to maintain their sovereignty and continue to be recognized as the true owners or the true indigenous inhabitants of the land. And so these place names, Mexican place names, often survive to this day. There are some widely used to this day, like Taconic, Copac, others less widely used, others no longer used, but were in common usage until the early 20th century, long after the Mexican people had been forced to Wisconsin, Ontario, and Oklahoma. We can move on to the next slide. I'm sorry if I'm taking too long. Um, So just quickly going to go into, what that landscape would have looked like if humans were not present. Remember that we live in a very wet, fairly temperate, but very seasonal continental climate. We don't live in a place that naturally sees frequent natural forest fires. It's just not dry enough. So that's why I have pictures in this. And for those who attended a presentation I did the other day, you'll recognize some of these slides. But the non-human, the other than human beings, I guess, or creatures who would be altering the landscape in a major way would be beavers and passenger pigeons, which as a species has only been extinct for a little bit over 100 years now. These are species that had a disproportionately huge impact on the landscape of Columbia County and the rest of the Northeast. I mean, imagine beavers as an example. Look at that beaver meadow. That's a place where beavers had dammed. The pond drained when it was abandoned after a few generations, became wetland, then it became meadow, then great shrubby thicket and edge habitat, and then pioneer tree species come in. So, you know, we're talking a landscape that would have had a lot more beavers. By the way, that wooden spoon, 17th century Mohican spoon in this picture has a beaver on it. If you could switch it around, you'd be able to see its tail. It's actually a really unique and beautiful wooden object. But anyway, my point is, there's a landscape that really would be relatively homogeneous if it wasn't, even with beavers, passenger pigeons, some of the other species changing the landscape. Next slide. Thank you. Um, so we know the Mohican people, according to their oral histories, which continue to this day, and according to everything from linguistic studies to even genetic research, archaeological evidence, which is a little harder to decipher, we know that their ancestors came into the Hudson Valley and Columbia County at some point over the last 2,000 years, and that they'd been living farther to the west. And if you go far enough back in time, their very distant ancestors were living somewhere towards the Pacific Northwest. That's where Algonquian family languages likely originated thousands of years ago. But by the time they had come to the Hudson Valley, to the Mexicanituck, which is their name for the river, and that's where the word Mohican comes from. It basically means the tidal people, the Hudson River being the great tidal estuary. By the time they came here, they were already agricultural people. They were already growing crops, some of which had been domesticated already in Eastern North America, like sunflowers and certain squash varieties. Others, like the flint corn you see in this picture, only came in later over generations as corn or maize was adapted to colder, shorter growing seasons like we have up here as opposed to Central America. And the reason I bring this up is, people who rely for a large part of their diet on agricultural crops that require full sunlight will need to do forest clearing. And that's exactly what they did. That's required girdling large trees, cutting down smaller trees, and setting fire to those bottomland areas. And they exclusively grew their crops in silt or sand loam soils, um, and down in the floodplains of creeks like Kinderhook Creek, Kleinkill, Claverick Creek, the Rojan, just using Columbia County as an example, the upper Rojan up towards um, what is it? Oh shoot, my brain's not working. Uh, well, anyway, I'm just gonna move on. But using fire to clear these areas so that by the time the Dutch arrived, they were encountering a largely treeless landscape in the lowlands. Okay, next slide. So you can see that on this late 17th century map, which is actually of Dutchess County. It's oriented with north to your left. You can see the Hudson River along the bottom. You're seeing this section of Dutchess County along Wappinger and the Fishkill. Hudson Highlands are on the right. You're seeing it as largely forested, but if you look close, and I'm sorry about the resolution, you'll see areas without trees, and it says a plain, a plain, a plain. These are prairie. These are treeless expanses. Observers were noting these were treeless for 4 or 5 miles in width, in diameter. And that was also true for large parts of Western Columbia County. And so in putting together this report, one of the things that I really had to focus on was how has the landscape changed since the Mohican people were no longer taking care of the land here, but also what did the landscape look like beforehand? Some of the public conservation areas today are largely forested and they may have been largely treeless 500 years ago, and vice versa. Some of the conservation areas today are largely open fields from New England settlers turning them into sheep pasture, and those fields have been maintained for hay. Those are areas that were probably covered in old growth forest 500 years ago. Next slide. So I mentioned the use of fire for clearing agricultural lands, but it was also used for clearing hunting grounds. So clearing out the forest understory, bringing in a new form of disturbance. I'm not going to get too much into fire. It's something that I talk about a lot. This is nothing new. Scholars have been talking about the use of fire by native peoples in Eastern North America for decades now. What I'm just going to mention briefly is that what this did was create a landscape in the areas adjacent to those lowlands where they grew their corn. It created a landscape dominated by white oak and black oak trees in the uplands around those bottomland areas where they grew this corn. What's so cool about that? And by the way, those random looking rocks on the middle of the page that you can see have hollows in them, those are nutting stones for cracking nuts like acorns that are from Columbia County. They were found south of Hudson. But anyway, what's unique about these oak trees, they support a huge diversity of species, not just species that feed on acorns or browse on oak leaves, like deer or wild turkeys or black bears or the elk and sandhill cranes that used to live here, but also pollinators and many other insects. And those in turn feed other species. And I use red-headed woodpeckers as another example of a species once commonly found in the Hudson Valley and which is extremely rare today, in part because those low intensity burns aren't happening anymore. So next slide. So this is a map I quickly put together. The data is coming from the U.S. Forest Service, and keep in mind this is modeled off of modern tree distribution. It's not necessarily accurate, but it is fairly accurate. I can say that just from my own experience. This is mostly southern Columbia County. You can see where Hudson would be up here towards the top left, Catskill across the river, down, you can see a little bit of Massachusetts on the very edge of the screen. I highlighted areas with green where white oaks and black oak trees are most common today. And the blue areas are where American beech trees and eastern hemlocks are most common today. And the yellow areas are areas with prime farmland where the landscape is largely flat with silt or sand loam soil. So not glacial till soils, not very clay. The areas where native people we know were basically where the Mohican people were exclusively growing their crops. And if you notice a pattern, you start to see it throughout the Hudson Valley, you see on the edge of these yellow areas a lot of green where the white and black oak dominated forests are. And generally, the farther you get away from them, you start seeing more blue from hemlocks and beech trees. And I just use those four tree species as the most typical examples of how native people were or were not changing the landscape depending on where they were. And it's something that's highly visible today. Basically, if you're driving through the Hudson Valley and you're seeing lots of oaks and hickory trees and sassafras and low bush blueberries in the understory, you know you're within a few miles of where the Mohican or other Lenape people had their permanent communities were growing their crops. If you're seeing predominantly red oaks and American beech and sugar maples and hemlocks, you know that you're in a more wild area where they may have been spending less time, let's say a buffer zone between different indigenous nations. And again, this is nothing new. It's something that scholars have known for a long time, but it seems to me not enough people know about this. And I just think it's so cool that even with all the vast changes that have happened in the landscape of Columbia County since and before native people were forced out. I'm talking about changes made by the newcomers, by the settlers. The dominant tree species today still reflect the legacy of the Mohican people modifying the land, stewarding the landscape, and creating arguably a much more biodiverse landscape, which is really cool. And I just think it would be, the neatest teaching tool for a land trust like Columbia Land Conservancy to have a report like this, to put this on interpretive signage so that when people are going on a hike, they're learning to see the landscape in a new way. And at the same time, become aware of the Mohican people and other native peoples who call this place their homeland, even though they no longer live here. And well, with one or two exceptions, who have moved back, but even though they have been displaced. Next slide. And I guess that's it. And I'll save, Kira come next. And, if any of you have any questions, I know I went really fast and I really glossed over a lot. But feel free to think of the questions, and leave it for the end, or just get in touch with me if it's a really specific, narrow focus that wouldn't be totally appropriate for tonight. Really feel free to email me. I might take a few days to get back just because I'm eternally behind schedule and everything, but I will get back to you. So, thank you.
Yes, well, thank you, Justin, for that. Um, so to start off, I'm gonna just talk a little about me first. So, hello, I'm Kira Gruber. I have my BA in political science from the University of Albany, and then also my MA in political science from the Rockefeller College. And my internship role over the summer was an education outreach intern for CLC. And some fun facts about me is I love the outdoors, which I'm sure all of us do if we're here. And I also love Game of Thrones. We can go to the next slide. So before this internship, I wasn't entirely sure what career path I wanted to take. As you can see, this is a little picture from my fifth grade yearbook. When asked what my future job would want to be, I always just wanted to do something that would help people. So, at a job fair at my university, I came across the CLC table with a smiling Mallory and our other coworker Rachel, as well as a bowl of apples. And when I learned about CLC's work in conservation, I was thrilled at the opportunity to spend my summer outdoors not just enjoying nature, which I did, but also helping to promote it and encourage others to connect with it. And I think that's really the heart of what we're doing, of what we're discussing tonight, making nature more accessible and inclusive for everyone. So, this is the condensed version of CLC's mission that we talked about earlier, but so we're on the unceded lands of the Mohican people. CLC recognizes the indigenous history of this land, honors ancestors past and present, and supports current efforts to build more equitable spaces for all the human and non-human relatives who call this place home. And I love that this is the message of CLC because historically, much of the land that we live on today was taken from Native communities, a reality that I believe is often left out of the conversation around conservation. So my project really focused on addressing this gap by creating an interpretive signage plan that highlights the cultural significance of Native people who originally inhabited this land. This gave me the chance to reflect on that and explore ways to amplify Native voices. And I learned that this kind of work needs a lot of respect and recognition of the deep connection Native people have with the land. And I think this project was about honoring that legacy. So, my main task was to work with the comprehensive, beautiful ethnoecology report that Justin put together, and which reimagined the land we love from the Native people. So, with the help of Rebecca, we were able to come up with some larger key themes to kind of keep me in check while I was reading. So, some of these included cultural use, geology, plants, animals, and a lot more. Again, it was very comprehensive in the best way possible. And while reading, I was able to flag important facts that I believe illustrated the land really well. And a personal favorite of mine that I talked about all summer was that the Mohican people considered otters spiritual leaders of the aquatic world, which is just the best fact I've ever learned. So the second part of the process was then collaborating with our PCA team to develop an interpretive signage plan. And to me, this was one of the most rewarding parts of the project because it allowed us to think critically about how to represent Native voices in a way that would resonate with visitors. And it felt really empowering to contribute to a project that prioritized telling the true cultural significance of the land and elevating the stories of those who stewarded it long before we did. Yeah. So the importance, which I think is very prevalent, I'm sure you can see it, but just to reiterate, that this project wasn't just about putting up signs. It was about reshaping how we approach conservation and education. By incorporating Native voices, we're not only preserving the land, but also honoring the cultural significance and the pre-colonial land stewardship of the people who have cared for it for years, long before we did. And when we amplify these voices, we create a more inclusive narrative that fosters a greater understanding and respect for both the land and its cultural significance. So, the personal impact. On a personal level, this internship gave me a completely new lens on which I view conservation in nature. I never really imagined myself. I always loved nature, but the deep connection that reading this ethnoecology report and going through this whole process did for me was just profoundly impacted me since then and will continue into the future. And as a political science student, kind of focusing more on Supreme Court, legal stuff, I didn't expect to find myself in this field, but I'm so grateful I did because this experience showed me how interconnected everything really is, and it's inspired me now to continue advocating for the land and the stories it holds and all the future work that I get to do. Thank you. That was the end of my little portion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kira. Thank you, Justin. We're now going to transition into our Q&A portion of our time together. And the first question that I had is, I know Justin and Kira, in our conversations together about the course of this evening, we talked about showing an example of one of the interpretive signs. And Rebecca, would you be able to pull that up in a second? Okay, then I will pivot and I will ask Justin a question. Um, Unless you had something to say before I jump in. Okay. So Justin, I was really fascinated by your discussion of the dominant tree species, and I wondered if you could share other examples of some of the legacies of Indigenous land stewardship that we can see on the land today in Columbia County.
Um, Trees are the easiest. Once you really get to know trees in all seasons, you could be driving on the Taconic or the Thruway, and you'll from the corner of your eye, you'll know if you're seeing a white oak dominated area or not. But in terms of other legacies, no, it's hard to answer other than when bringing in plant communities, really, and those associated especially with the use of low intensity fire. So a lot of smaller plants, many of which are declining today. New Jersey tea being a prime example. It really relies on fire, but it persists for a long time without it. You'll often find it on sunny, dry, well-drained hillsides in different parts of the county. Um, there are a number of plants like that which are persisting or slowly declining, and really, oh shoot, what's it? Conrad and Claudia Vispo's book on the environment in the county, I think, is probably the best resource out there for anybody who's has these kind of questions and is interested in how plants have changed over the past few centuries in the county. In terms of other legacies, very little. I'm trying to think of other ways in which their ancestor of the Mohican people shaped the landscape in a way that we can visibly see it today. And unfortunately, a lot of the fauna that largely existed here because of their land and management methods, it's just no longer here. They are either driven to extirpation or extinction by the settlers who came later, or the environment just couldn't support them anymore. And that actually, interestingly, was something that I hadn't realized in my many years of doing this kind of work, it was really working on this report for Columbia Land Conservancy that I began to realize just what an impact environmental degradation had on the lives of the Mohican people and other native peoples in the region and probably throughout Eastern North America, and what an impact that had on influencing um, their communities to really either sell the land or leave, join missions like in Stockbridge or move west, get out of the region, not just get out of the region in order to preserve traditional ways of life, but also just because the landscape couldn't support people anymore. There are so many streams that were dammed that anadromous fish and catadromous fish like eels, maybe their numbers were starting to go down. We know that many large game animals had disappeared from large areas of Columbia County by the 1740s. So that's something that really blew my mind, was how fast environmental degradation happened, and that actually oftentimes was a major factor in the choice behind the Mohican people to leave their land. So sorry if I couldn't really answer that question that well.
No, I think that was a fantastic and really thoughtful answer. Thank you, Justin.
Yeah.
We have one question from Tatiana, who says that we have a lot to learn from Indigenous people about our attitude and approach toward the environment, and wonders, Justin, if you could expand on that theme or topic at all.
Yeah, I could try, and keep in mind, like what I'm going to be telling you is not just what I've learned from the historic record, from ethnographic field notes, but also what I've learned just from spending time with Northeastern Native peoples. And, again, this is coming from my understanding of their worldview and their beliefs and culture. But one thing I've observed, and this is true for virtually everyone I've met from the displaced communities who call the Hudson Valley their homeland, is this, a different way of relating to other species, seeing them basically as other than human sentient beings. And that goes beyond what Western science might be considered to be alive. A rock or the sun would also be considered, or are also considered, to be sentient beings. Not that in addition to living in a world of relationship where you are taught from a young age, little kids growing up, let's say on the Moravian Town Reserve, which is one of the larger indigenous communities that exist today. It's in Ontario, larger communities with ancestry from the Hudson and Delaware valleys. Little kids there are taught to call all old people their grandparents. That's just a part of day-to-day life. But you're also taught, at least in traditional families, that different species are our brothers, sisters, that the sun is an elder brother, that water is a mother, or the earth is our mother, etc. That the thunder is a grandfather. And I think that viewing the rest of the world around you as sentient and also as a relative goes a long way in, how in shaping how you treat other species, your relationship with the land. And I just, it's funny because it seems like this just different ethos, this different way of relating and living with the land is pretty. And also, in when I mentioned calling old people grandparents, that it's just as deep respect for elders that I've found in individuals who feel like they're fairly, I hate to use the word assimilated, but feel like they don't know a lot about traditional culture and ways. I think sometimes people that I've met from their communities don't even realize how traditional they can be in their way of thinking. And I will just note, no, not that this is totally related, but I just, when I've said that there's a lot we can learn for those of us living here today in their ancestral homeland, having had, the privilege both of growing up here and of getting to visit and stay in a number of their communities in Wisconsin and Ontario, I can just tell you that the forest is, I mean, mind-blowingly more healthy. Like I've never seen better tree regeneration, a healthier native shrub layer, fewer invasive species, and more spring ephemerals than I have in a Stockbridge Mohican reservation in Wisconsin or in the Lenape communities in Ontario, or even then the one day I spent in the Mohawk reservation of Akwesasne on the Canadian-New York border. I mean, it's pretty amazing.
Wow. Thank you. another question for you, Justin, and then Kira, get ready. I have a question on deck for you as well. And so Justin, what were some of the things that Native communities in this area looked for to decide where to establish their homes and their dwellings? The question gives one example, perhaps proximity to creeks. And they're asking this wondering, where these settlements might have been located. So what were some of the things these communities looked for to find their homes and spaces?
So with exception, really, the ideal location to live, you're gonna build your house in a place where you're not gonna get hit by floods in the springtime. You want to be within a short walking distance of where you can reach those rich resources of the Hudson River estuary. So you don't have to be on the banks of the Hudson River itself, but you want to be within a couple-hour walk of a place where you can go down to a tributary of the Hudson, and there might be a natural barrier in the water, like a set of rapids. And in that place, you can easily catch huge numbers of shad or herring or striped bass or maybe sturgeon or eels in the fall. So you have that resource. And you also want to have those soils that I mentioned, those sand or silt loam soils down in the bottomlands that were mostly left to us by Glacial Lake Albany. Those are the places that mostly grow corn today. So if you go to, I'll use this as an example for Columbia County. It's one of my favorites. Go to the village of Clavering. You're on a terrace of land. Look where all the old Dutch houses are. They're made of stone and brick. You're on a terrace of land overlooking a huge flat floodplain, largely planted with corn. Those fields have probably been more or less planted with corn for the past 1,500 years. There were breaks, I'm sure, but that terrace of land where those old houses is, that is exactly the kind of place that Lenape people choose to put their houses. With one exception, the Mohican people were unique in also living on islands in the Hudson River. And the Hudson River was one extremely rich in islands from Columbia and Greene County northward, very few south of there. In fact, that's where most of the remaining tidal wetlands are today. Most of those islands are gone because once the river was dredged up for shipping channels, the dredging spoil was the islands were connected to each other, connected to the land. It looks a lot different today, but a lot of those islands were really important to the Mohican people. There's a reason they're called the Mohican people or the tidal estuary people. They were intimately familiar with that river, more so than other Lenape groups, I would argue, because they were living in the middle of the river as often as not. But yeah, those are the things you want to be in close proximity to. Good land to grow your corn, above where the floods are, and within a short walk of where you can get those aquatic resources, not just fish, also edible aquatic plants, snapping turtles, etc.
Fantastic. Here we had one question that talked about seeing interns grow into their own. And I am curious about the impact of your time at CLC and your internship, what that did to your view on conservation and your connection to being outdoors and spending time outside in the environment.
Yeah, so well, as I stated before, I always loved nature, but I can't say necessarily I knew much about it, let alone a lot of like the histories behind like exactly what's in that ethnoecology report. And and I always like to say, whenever I have new experiences, I feel like I get a new pair of glasses, a new lens on how I get to view the world. And after my internship at CLC, I definitely have a new pair of conservation environmental glasses that I get to bring into every job or every just interaction I have in the future because um I think a lot of the, like, for example, in my job currently, like at the Thruway Authority, you wouldn't necessarily think it's so focused on nature, and it is like a lot focused on engineering and infrastructure. But because I have this lens, I'm able to give the input of maybe considerations regarding the environment or how we use some of the land that we are using for that. And I think just like how Justin said, I feel like I understand the stories of the land a lot more now and how that shapes how we use them today. And I do feel just a more appreciation and relation. And I'm just proud to have worked at CLC and get to share this perspective further.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kira. Justin, we have a few questions that are wondering where and how they can learn more. We have specifically one question, which is thinking about Troy, New York, and Rensselaer County. Where would you direct folks to continue their own education on this topic?
So there are a lot of outdated books out there, and I'm talking like a lot of books written by scholars as recently as the 90s. At this point are, they're not necessarily accurate. What I always recommend to people as an extremely well-researched book that's very, very easily accessible. It's not full of academic jargon. The book that I'm recommending is called The Memory of All Ancient Customs by Tom Arnmidtrod. I still have to ask him how he pronounces his name. Um, I recommend his book to everyone. He did such a good job on describing the native nations of the Hudson Valley and how they dealt with colonization. And the book, basically it's just talking about that century and a half. It doesn't go beyond it. There are a number of books, really good books, that focus on the Mohican people when, more than half of the Mohican people had become part of the Stockbridge mission and then became known as the Stockbridge Mohican Nation. Um, I, you know, some of them are a little bit more narrow. They only focus on a few decades, might be early 20th century or the early 19th century, and they can be a little more scholarly. But if you're interested in that full, later history of the Stockbridge Mohican people, I'd be happy to share resources through email. But number one, I would recommend is A Memory of All Ancient Customs. If it's okay, one thing I forgot to get into in the presentation, I would just like to mention quickly. I had noted about how important the use of place names and language were in this research. Now, keep in mind the Mohican language has not been spoken as a first language since about 1940. The last speakers lived on or just off the reservation in Wisconsin, and there were a few people with a partial command of the language in one of the communities in Ontario until the 1930s. And unfortunately, not that many ethnographers or linguists visited these last speakers. And only a few Mohican people over the course, we have records going back to the 1740 where Mohican people are writing in their own language, writing letters, creating small vocabularies, but nothing like a really large comprehensive dictionary exists. And currently, the Stockbridge Mohican Nation has a language department, and they're working hard to put together all those different sources and basically reconstruct and revitalize the language. But I bring that up because Columbia County not only has many Mohican place names today, and I mean hundreds when you go back into the historic record. Columbia County, I think, uniquely is the only county in the Hudson Valley that I can think of where every single place name is in the Mohican language only. You get to Rensselaer County to the north, and you start getting sometimes place names from neighboring Algonquin languages that were once spoken in Western Massachusetts and Vermont. And that's because of a New England refugee community that lived in that area between the 1680s and 1755. Or in Albany County, you get a few Mohawk place names after a disastrous war in which the Mohawks then started selling Mohican land in Albany County because of right of conquest. So Columbia County is kind of unique in both the number of Mohican place names it contains or contained and the fact that they're all in the Mohican language. But that also makes it very difficult to translate them, to decipher them. But by very carefully comparing them to the closest languages to Mohican, like Munsee and Western Abenaki, which are still spoken as first languages, they can tell you a lot about the former landscape And that's something I get into in the report when possible. And a few of the place names I did translate with the help of the language department for the Stockbridge Mohican tribe. The rest really, are that I would love to get their help to properly, have real professionals go through them.
Thank you. Rebecca, just to be mindful of our time, we have a few minutes left together. If we could bring up one of the examples of the interpretive signage, which is really the culmination of the ethnoecology report produced by Justin and its interpretation by Kira. Justin, is there anything that you wanted to share about the use of the ethnoecology report and how it can be brought to life through these signs?
Um, hmm. No, I mean, I'm not sure how to answer that. I think the way that Kieran, you guys have done this, just, I think is absolutely perfect. I mean, I, I'm, this is exactly, I couldn't have hoped for something better than this. So, the one
Justin,
thing I
thank
could
you.
say, okay, so um, ideally this information could be made accessible, and because of the QR codes it could be to members of both the Stockbridge Mohican Nation and some of the other displaced Lenape communities, particularly those who live in Ontario today. Actually a couple different installations that I worked on where we were getting the approval of their tribal council, that was a requirement that we put this information online, and basically create a section of a website so that that information would be accessible to tribe members today. So, these interpretive signs alone, if could just be, if a number of web pages were created with these interpretive signs, that would just be one cool way that that information would then be accessible to the descendants of the people that who, these signs are like inspired by.
And we will absolutely do that. So we'll have that information on the CLC website and a new project that will be announced in April. So mark your calendars now. Um, we did a couple different kinds of signs. Some of them are more focused on land use. So we've got this one will be installed at UMS over in Chatham in one of the fields where we talk about how the landscape has been shaped through time. And then we also have some signs that will be, let me see if I can switch to the other sign. Um, More focused on our non-human animal, oh, come on now, relatives. And my computer is upset that I am trying to show such large files, but um, we'll see if it will come up now. Everybody be excited. Okay, so here is another sample sign. This one will also be installed at UMS near the pond. And so we're focusing on different animals that use the pond. And then where possible, we plan to have the common names, the Latin names, the Spanish names, and then the Mohican and Munsee names when those are available. And that's something that we're working on with Justin as well. If you are a Spanish speaker, please know that this is just placeholder text that has not been translated by a human yet, but that will happen shortly because these are drafts. We are hoping these will be installed this summer. So we'll share more with folks as that continues.
Thank you, Rebecca, for pulling up that example. With that, again, just a few moments left here in our time together. And I would like to give Kira a moment to talk about if there was of any, I know you mentioned otters and the significance of that fact in all of your reading, and And we are going to be sharing the ethnoecology report with all of you after this call. So you'll have a chance to dive into really the incredible depth of knowledge that is presented there. Kira, if there was an interpretive sign or information that you would love to see presented, what are you most excited about walking the trails and being able to learn about when you return to one of your favorite places in Columbia County?
Ah, there's a lot to choose from. I mean, my number one has got to be the otters. It is really the most interesting and fun thing I've ever learned. It's my favorite thing. But I'm also an animal lover in general, so it's cool hearing about the native names for animals, as well as the animals that were around during that time that are no longer here, like the passenger pigeon. And I think seeing a lot of that represented throughout the trails is something I'm definitely looking forward to when I get to go hiking in the spring and summer.
Fantastic. Well, with that, I want to say a tremendously big thank you to Justin and Kira for joining us, and we'll do a virtual round of applause. Thank you both so much for joining us and speaking. And I also want to say thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. There are a million and one things that you can do on a Tuesday night, and you chose to spend an hour here with us, and we're incredibly grateful for that. With that, I'll say good night. We will be sending the resources, the books that Justin has mentioned, and we look forward to continuing this conversation through our work. We will see you on January 21st for the next community conversation, which will focus on affordable farmland and feature Blake Hill and talk about his flower farm, Husman Hill Flower Farm. So thank you so much and have a great evening.
Thank you.